Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, and I'm here today with Bruegel's director, Jeroen Zettelmeijer, and Beatrice Weber de Mauro, the president of CEPR, and also a professor in Geneva. And she is going to talk with us about a new book that has come out from Bruegel and CEPR. And Beatrice, with that, could you explain why we're doing this now and what are the most important things about it?
Yeah, hello, Rebecca. It's great to be here with you. And Jeroen, it's a real pleasure to talk about something that is maybe not a total pleasure to talk about, because the background is, of course, something worrying. We have a world which has dramatically changed over the last years in terms of our general outlook on the geopolitics, on the geoeconomics, and on the responses that Europe needs to craft in order to cope with a world in which the forces of different powers are just so much stronger, and Europe is somewhere in the middle. And that's the background against which about a year ago, with Jeroen and Jean Pisani-Ferry, the three as conveners, we decided to embark on a new project called ITCAI, we called it. So the important topics of common European interest. The kind of things that don't receive enough attention in many of the programs that we are already running because they are common. And the first ITCAI that we set up was on Europe's economic security. That's the title of the book that you mentioned. It's a book composed of several chapters, which were the papers that we commissioned. They go into greater depth into different issues that we will probably touch on. And there is a summary chapter, which we also issued as a separate policy paper from Bruegel and from CEPR. And that tries to distill the policy lessons. What have we learned and what can we say? Where do we stand today in terms of recommendations for improving Europe's economic security?
When we talk about economic security, are we talking mostly about the relationship between the European Union and countries that are not its traditional allies? Are we also looking at the transatlantic relationship? What countries are we talking about?
We're talking about primarily the great powers, and in this book, there is a lot of focus on China. So the question whether China could be a threat in terms of its possibilities to decouple from us, as we have seen the sudden decoupling, need to decouple from Russia, or whether there is explicit coercive actions that we have also seen China deploy in different countries. But possibly we are talking more about China than about the US, because right now this is, and the whole trade issue has been part of the shocks that we've seen in the past. We also should worry about possibilities of threats coming from the US.
Jeroen, how do we anchor ourselves in this conversation? Economic security, strategic autonomy, the different iterations of that, they all sort of blend together. What makes this the urgent focus right now?
So we view economic security as one of the important ingredients of strategic autonomy, but it's not the only one. And we do not try to define strategic autonomy in this book, right? So strategic autonomy is an even fuzzier concept. We try to be precise, though, about what we mean by economic security. And so basically, economic security for us has two ingredients. The first is the economic aspects of national security. So this is protecting ourselves and our allies against economic malfeasance, so deliberate attempts to inflict harm from outside actors. So normally we would think of them as states, but they could also be, say, the Houthis attacking shipping lines. It could be terrorism. And the difference to national security here is that we do not look at military threats or even, attacks on infrastructure, attacks through viruses, all this stuff. We look at, if you like, conventional channels of economic harm. And so this is primarily trade, but it could also be finance, it could be profit repatriation, it could be seizing assets abroad, that stuff. But then we also have a second angle, which economists have worried about for a long time, which is external crises that get transmitted primarily through trade, but potentially also through finance, right? And so a lot of the interest in economic security arose not just because we started getting worried more about not so friendly foreign powers. And by the way, this started with Trump as well. So it's not just China, but because of the COVID experience with the supply chains breaking down and this contributing to a significant degree, for example, to the rise in inflation in the EU. So that is part of economic security for us as well. The concept that is not in economic security as we define it in this book is domestic crises. And it's important to think that this is relevant too, and that in some cases, things that we might do to protect ourselves from economic threats outside the country may make us more vulnerable to domestic problems inside our country. So this is one of the reasons why we need trade, for example.
It seems like when we're making these decisions, we have to weigh competitiveness, which is making money, with these security concerns that may cost money up front. How do we put that together and help the economy overall?
I wouldn't put it in terms of competitiveness and making money. It is more a question of insurance and the probability of risk, of big shocks. What we are talking about are new types of shocks. We have experienced, as Jeremy was just saying, within COVID and the supply chain shock, something that was not anticipated. Supply chains could break down on a massive scale and very quickly, even through blockage of a canal and things like that. But the question there is, therefore, yes, it is costly to have to insure against these kind of sudden disruptions. It means shortening supply chains in some cases. But the next type of risk that we're talking about, namely the risks of deliberate action by states, and the question is there, how probable are those? How large could those be? In the case of the Russian gas cutoff, we saw that those costs can be very high, and therefore preparing for something like that, or for reducing the economic cost of such type of shocks, is worth paying an insurance premium. That is, I think, more the logic. It's not about decreasing our competitiveness. It is about insuring against risks.
I mean, I think what you may have also had in mind with your question, Rebecca, is that there could be some inevitable trade-offs, which we analyze at length. And so those trade-offs certainly occur with respect to the benefits of trade. So something that makes us more vulnerable is specialization in trade, because if you're highly specialized, you only produce certain goods for export, you import other stuff, and then rely entirely on imports for those goods, then of course you're vulnerable to disruptions in those imports, right? At the same time, that sort of specialization is what economists teach is the source of the welfare gains from trade, because everyone produces what they are relatively good at, right? So there's a very clear trade-off there, and so we try to navigate them, that trade-off. But there are also other trade-offs, so we point out to them in our chapter. The first one is the one I already mentioned, that we might expose ourselves more to domestic risks if we reduce trade dependency. The second one, which I think is probably the most important one when it comes to China in particular, is that there could be some real political costs and particularly damage to international cooperation if we go autarkic, right? If we start sort of aggressively cutting down on our foreign trade links, right? So this will upset our partners and could make it more difficult to cooperate in areas where we really need them. And then finally, another very specific EU-specific problem of sort of an aggressive strategy of lowering international integration is that we have different countries in the EU that have different interests in how and to what degree they want to trade and with whom. And so if we really go aggressive on that, we could also lose a lot of our EU cohesion, which in turn, ironically, makes us more vulnerable to acts of coercion. So a good example is the strategy of President Xi of China when he visited the EU. So he visited France, where he met both with President Macron and President von der Leyen of the European Commission, but he's also going to Hungary. He's not going to Germany. So he picked, in a sense, a pro-European country at the center. And then he is going to some countries that have deviated from the course charted by the center. And that is a problem, potentially, if China threatens a particular member of the union, because it will sow division.
Thanks so much for that. I find it's helpful for me anyway to think about these two things at the same time, because otherwise we end up just talking past each other. On the one hand, we're talking about Chinese overcapacity and ways to help the economy stay competitive. And on the other hand, we're talking about something that is much more ephemeral, this idea of how do we protect ourselves from shocks? Both of these things are going through the same industries and the same companies.
Yeah, I mean, these are different concepts. So they are very often conflated. So if you look at strategic autonomy speeches, they conflate security, they conflate competitiveness. Indeed, they're different concepts. We would be concerned with competitiveness in a world that had no external economic threats whatsoever of the type that we are talking about. Okay, so competitiveness is primarily about growth. It's about dynamic economies, and then the idea that sometimes our companies may compete with others, which is generally a good thing for dynamic growth. But if it is done unfairly, it can harm our growth, and then there can be a potential for tension. So that's a whole different ballgame. It's a discussion of its own right. We are talking about threats, shocks, disruptions. Now, there is, of course, a link somewhere, several steps of the argument removed, which is this idea that if we fail to be competitive, then in critical areas, that produces dependency on other countries because our own companies are not able to produce this stuff, which turns out to be really important for either our military strength or the green transition or something important. And then that becomes a security issue too, right? But that's where the two strands link up. But primarily, these are different strands.
But I think there is a deeper problem, even, Jeremy, than the conflation of, that's why I do not like the word competitiveness, because it typically does conflate everything, right?
Indeed.
Everything everybody wants is competitiveness, has to be, by definition, kind of thing. As economists, we like to think in terms of efficiency and in terms of where the market fails. And in principle, we should be here also talking or starting from the basis, why are companies not taking these risks into account themselves? Isn't it in their interest to self-insure? Because after all, it is a problem for them if all of a sudden they can no longer procure vital inputs and they can no longer sell the intermediate goods to their customers or the final goods to the customers. So why can we not trust firms to take this type of risk into account as well? And the answer to a certain extent is that we can. It's just that they had not experienced, we collectively had not experienced these shocks. There is much, much more de-risking taking place at the firm level today. And this is a part of what the first chapter in the book, which I suppose we're going to get to soon, does emphasize, is that there may be a market failure in the following sense, that every firm knows very well its own suppliers, but it may not know the suppliers of its suppliers. And the whole network of dependencies that is implicit in these very long supply chains, that starting with the fact that this is not well known to the firm, it may be hard for the firm to optimally ensure. And so a first market failure that Isabelle Méjean has been emphasizing is that we need the information about where the vulnerabilities are. And that this data is in principle could be available, but that we are not collecting it. So you see, the market failure here would be one of the firms not even being able, even if they were willing to spend the cost of self-insurance, they may not be able to do so. So that may be a first type of market failure. And there may be others that lead to a conclusion that we need some kind of intervention.
That is a super helpful approach to the issue, and I appreciate both of you digging in a little bit to these distinctions between security, competitiveness, self-protection, because it is really helpful to people trying to get their heads around the issue. When we come back, we'll talk more about these needs and market failures and the policy recommendations in your book. I'm here with Jeramin Zettelmeier and Beatrice Veda de Mauro, and we are talking about European economic security and how the bloc can prepare itself better to withstand shocks that might come up. We were just saying how the first step is thinking about the risks that are out there and how too many companies don't see all of the risks to which they are exposed. How do we go about expanding what people are preparing for and making sure that they set aside the right safeguards?
So one good point to start is to look at what the European Commission in particular has already tried to do. And to their great credit, they have been really ahead of, even the academic debate on this. And so, starting in the late teens and then particularly after COVID, economic security plays a role in a variety of legislative acts of the Commission. We will get to those in a bit more detail later, but there is a lot of emphasis in these acts to de-risking imports. So the magic word here is de-risking, not decoupling. This comes from a famous speech by Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, in March of last year. So this reflects precisely this desire to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, to keep trading, to keep the gains from trade, but to trade in a way that is less risky. And so the question then becomes, what does it mean, de-risking? And so there is an answer which the Commission in effect has given and which is quite widely shared. And that answer is that you start by identifying product lines, particularly on the import side, that is we, the EU, are particularly dependent on, and that could cause economic harm if we experience a disruption, whether this is a deliberate or an accidental disruption. So you start identifying these product lines at the most disaggregated, the most specific granular level possible. And then you try through a combination of industrial policy and trade policy to reduce dependence on that large, chunky import country that you're importing from. So in many cases, this would be China. You don't necessarily try to sort of reproduce the capacity that you are using to import at home, but you certainly try to diversify trade. And sort of you do this for these specific products, these choke points, and then you're sort of done. And so there is a lot of appeal, and there's a very clear rationale for this approach. But what we find through the various chapters of the book is that this approach is also very limited in two important respects. The first is that it really disproportionately focuses on imports, which is something that's understandable because that's where recent examples of coercion have come from. But it's also where the trauma of the COVID-related supply disruptions come from. However, the European Union is just as dependent or even more dependent through its exports to China and other countries, right? We have a current account surplus. We also produce a lot domestically in the markets that we serve abroad. And so we are vulnerable to things like seizures of assets, interruption of profits, and potentially financial coercion. So this obsession with imports is too one-sided. But then there's a sort of deeper and more fundamental problem with the approach that the Commission and many others have been advocating, which is that ultimately we will never know enough to really be safe by de-risking at the product level, because we will always miss dependencies that are important. And in many cases, we will also commit the opposite mistake of exaggerating dependencies that may not be so important. And the reason is that even though it may look like, we are importing most from one country right now, it's fairly easy to substitute away from those import relationships in a crisis, or indeed to just consume less of this good or substitute towards other goods that are consumed in a crisis. And so the big case in point here is the Russia energy shock, which was viewed as a huge threat to the German economy, and indeed in the long term it is. But the short-term disruptions that it caused were far lower than was feared. And to the credit of the economic profession, a bunch of economists, including a team that contributed one chapter to our book, predicted that. So they said, look, there is plenty of substitutability, and it's not going to be that bad. And indeed, it wasn't that bad. So basically, you can either over-predict risks or you can under-predict them. And for this reason, relying on this product-by-product de-risking approach is not enough. And what we argue in the book is that you need other tools. And basically, the main other tool you need is to strengthen resilience more generally, but also to deter coercion.
And if I can add to that, because I think we wouldn't want to leave listeners with the impression that the whole Russia gas, energy and inflation shock was not that bad, because it did have quite large implications, but not as large on growth as initially feared in Germany. But I do think it was absolutely a lesson in what can happen if you are not prepared. The costs of having to deal with that shock were just very, very large. And they are a large part of the big inflation shock that we saw in Europe, at least, come from the energy prices. And therefore, it is absolutely reasonable to think about and this is the perspective that this chapter takes. This is chapter 3 in the book, I believe. What if we did not have to decouple only from Russia, but had to decouple suddenly from China? So basically taking a even much, much bigger economy and dependence. And there it is strongly also an export dependence, as Jermaine was saying. And trying to estimate the short and longer term economic output loss of such a decoupling. I mean, the punchline there, again, it's less than you thought. If you do it gradually over time, that's the bottom line. But this result depends very strongly on the ability of Europe to not only keep its internal trade, but also to be able to substitute in trade with the rest of the world, those who are not. Basically, the idea here is you have two camps. You have the G7 and you have Russia and China economy that we decouple from Russia, China, but we still trade with the rest of the world. And then the answer is that such a shock for the German economy would on impact be something in the area of 5% of GDP. If it was done over time, and substitution therefore can kick in much more gradually, then you're talking about a total GDP output cost of about 1.5%.
That's really interesting. Certainly the need to prepare, because doing something over time is always easier than doing it all at once. And also, it seems like you were just talking about a fragmentation of the world. In the past, we were looking at the G20, which had much more cooperation between these different poles that you outlined. And now it seems like China and Russia and the G7 are having to work more independently and not through the G20 and other broader fora. Is that one of the consequences of the new economic security environment?
Not necessarily. So we would not argue for it. In that sense, we do agree with von der Leyen that the objective is to de-risk, not decouple. But the de-risking is a bit more complicated than just this product-by-product choke point reduction approach. It is also possible that the de-risking will involve reducing trade integration with a place like China, where you think that trade relations may be a lot more volatile in the future, preemptively, right? So there could be an argument based on the chapter that Beatrice just summarized for some preemptive de-risking that applies to exports and imports across the board, right? This is very difficult to do. So there's some discussion of instruments. And it's not clear whether it's worth it or not, given that the worst thing that can happen, according to this particular study, is a 5% output decline in the event of a cataclysmic sudden decoupling, which seems fairly unlikely. So even, with this relatively hawkish hat on, I think we're not talking about a new Cold War. We are talking about a trade at a possibly lower level than is the case right now, and at paying more attention to how we trade. And then very importantly, and these are aspects that we emphasize a lot, it's not just about how much we trade and who we trade with, but it's also about our own ability to flexibly respond to disruptions, right? So this is the resilience argument. We will never know where the next shock comes from. We are currently very much fighting the last battle. Again, we are focusing entirely on these import shocks that were indeed relevant during COVID. And so we make a big pitch in the chapter that the single market, because it gives us more options to trade at lower frictions within ourselves, is a really important tool for economic security, not just for competitiveness or growth, like the argument is made. This also comes up a little bit in the letter report, but perhaps not enough. So the single market is the one win-win measure where there is no trade-off. So it will be better for growth and for economic security. And then the other thing which we emphasize, and where one has to give the Commission really good marks, so that they have done very well, is the so-called anti-coercion instrument. So if you don't know what the next shock is going to be, what the next harmful act of some foreign power is going to be, then a good idea is to prevent those things. And how do you prevent them when it's deliberate? Well, by deterring.
I'm going to stop here and just back up a little bit to help listeners catch up. As you so rightly point out, economic security and de-risking specifically has two components. It's got this resilience component, like we'd like to get something from China, but it can't get here because there's a pandemic. And then there's the security threat, which is separate from resilience, which is we'd like something from China and China deliberately won't give it to us or will make it hard for us to get it because they want to make a political point or a strategic point. And it seems to me that that is where the coercion comes in. So could you give our listeners just a couple of examples of economic coercion and how they came up, and then we can come back to this idea of how to respond to that?
Indeed. So one example of economic conversion is China deciding to stop exports from China to another country in areas that are important for that other country. So one important example here are so-called critical raw materials, rare earths. So these are inputs which many countries rely on from China. And so if they stop coming, it will hurt you. So China did something like that with respect to Japan some time ago. And it recently reacted by restricting exports of one critical raw material more generally in response to the EU anti-subsidy investigation into electric vehicles. So that is one possibility. And another possibility is to restrict exports. And in China, it's fairly easy to do this without appearing to do so through boycotts. So through the social media, by having a social media campaign that effectively discourages buying from a particular country. So one country that was on the receiving end of an export boycott was Australia, with respect to wine, for example. And it was in that particular area, it was quite painful. So that is what we have in mind.
Thanks so much for helping us think through that, Yeraman. So how does this anti-coercion instrument work, and what's at stake there?
So this is a law, so a regulation, a European regulation that authorizes the Commission with approval of the Council, so the member states, but just with simple majority, so it's not hard to get this approval, to, in effect, retaliate against companies of countries that are found to exercise economic coercion against the EU. And the extraordinary thing about this is that this retaliation can happen through virtually any any means. So to the point that a company could no longer sell in the EU at all. And so the EU, the Commission has always emphasized that this is never supposed to happen. This is purely for deterrence, because if it happened, it may actually violate the rules of the World Trade Organization. But nonetheless, there is a political signal and certainly a legal framework that makes this possible. And we think this is a good thing because it would cover any threat. You don't need to know in advance, unlike with these de-risking strategies, where the next threat is going to come from.
Super helpful. When we come back, we will talk more about the forward-looking policy implications of the book and help you get to know some of the people who made it happen. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you, Yereman and Beatrice, for coming on to talk about this project. What are the main forward-looking recommendations that you would like people to take away from this?
So there are really three. One is that because we will never quite be able to identify the source of the threat and how damaging it is, we need to really push a resilience strategy further, right? And that is particularly a single market strategy. So it goes into the same direction as the letter reports. The second main point is that we do have to refocus a bit from import dependence on export dependence and financial dependence. And so one thing that I'm worried about is that there are large companies in the EU that depend on a very large share of their profits on China, and so are making themselves vulnerable. And so we're not necessarily saying that they have to export less to China, but there needs to be some preparation, I think, of how one would deal with a hostile act without that company being threatened and then, going to the government and running for a bailout. And so we would like to think about a prudential approach to these export-linked or foreign production-linked threats. And then the third thing that we are emphasizing is that one thing that we haven't worried about at all, and the reason is that we were at the other end of the stick here, we were the ones that were, in a sense, imposing these measures, is financial coercion. So, as you know, and you have worked on this, we and the United States have been imposing a variety of financial sanctions on Russia. But in the past, these types of sanctions were also sometimes viewed as a potential threat for the European companies when, for example, President Trump pulled out of the Iran Accord, and there was a debate about whether the US should impose its sanctions on Iran by threatening so-called secondary sanctions on companies from other countries, including European allies, for violating those sanctions. And so, in principle, the US could do these sorts of things if President Trump comes back. And so it's something which we may have to anticipate and worry about a bit.
I guess one way of putting it is that if we went back 1 year and did this again, there would be 2 additional chapters in this book. One would be about these kind of financial dependencies and interdependencies and where Europe needs to worry about them. Again, this is not primarily a topic about China, although those may be increasing if profit repatriation becomes the main source of dependence of European industry from China rather than exports and imports. So the financial dependence and possibilities of being vulnerable to financial coercion is one chapter that we would like to add, and hopefully forward-looking, we don't have to worry about, but we should start preparing for. And that is, of course, more linked to the US and possibly return of President Trump. The other thing that we should worry about And that is not covered by just saying we need to reinforce the single market. I mean, the single market needs to be reinforced for many, many reasons, and they mostly have to do with more efficiency, with better allocation of resources, with more growth. But there is also an aspect of what we just saw this week. President Xi goes to Paris and then he goes to Budapest. And the German, when we went to the Chancellery on Monday after presenting this report, the headline on the newspaper Tagesspiegel said, he is coming to divide. That was the clear and present danger. Is not that he is coming to shake hands, but is coming to attempt to divide the European Union's interests and stances in the face of possible threats, or put differently, the unity of action. And therefore, for instance, the credibility of any anti-coercion stance as a deterrence depends on there being a sufficient level of solidarity within Europe, there being a sufficient level of unity in facing or in the willingness to actually act together in the face of any kind of coercion that may be very, very specifically directed at one country or one sector, and usually will be, because the vide et impera is not something that China has invented. It has been perfected over centuries by Western powers, and a Trump #1 also tried to play that card. So there are aspects of resilience which have to do not only with improving our integration in terms of the single market, but also the integration and the common action in the face of individual threats. So those are two aspects that forward-looking may be more important than they have been in the past, unfortunately.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought up the need for Europe to get itself on the same page, because a divided Europe is not going to be able to put together the resilience that will be necessary. For listeners who are interested in more, you will be able to find the book at cepr.org, and also a summary and a policy brief about it at bruegel.org. You will hear other aspects of this brought out in other channels. So, Yarman, can you give us just an overview of what are the chapters of this book? Who are the people who put it together, and maybe help people who want to go look for more and know where to go?
Sure, absolutely. So we have 6 chapters. 2 are, if you like, hardcore economic research. One is empirical, the other one involves a model. So the empirical chapter, which is an attempt to go much further, as far as possible, to identify import dependencies at the product level, is written by 2 French researchers, Isabelle Méjean from the Paris School of Economics and Pierre Rousseau, who is a doctoral student. It's called Identifying European Trade Dependencies. And then we have a very ambitious chapter that's called What If? The Effects of a Hard Decoupling from China on the German Economy. It's, by the way, not just on the German economy, but essentially on all EU plus G7 economies. And they even have some numbers in that chapter of how China itself would be hit. And this is by a pretty large group of authors that are trade specialists: David Bakay, Julian Hinz, Benjamin Moll, Moritz Schularik, Feodora Teti, Joschka Wanner, and Xiwang Yang. And then we have one chapter that's super interesting, and we didn't talk about much. That's about industrial policy, and it takes a historical view of industrial policy and looks how it has been used in the shadow of conflict. So in similar context as it's being discussed today, and that is written by Morgan Kelly and Kevin O'Rourke, 2 eminent Irish economic historians. And finally, we have 2 policy chapters, one on trade policy by Chad Bown, who was a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and is now the chief economist of the State Department in the United States. And finally, by Conor McAfee and Nicholas Poitiers, 2 Bruegel researchers, and they're writing about EU instruments for economic security.
Thank you so much for that. I think this is going to be a great resource for people trying to get their head around this and frame these issues so they can take policy steps. Any closing thoughts from either of you as we send people off to go read further?
Well, maybe just to tell you that we launched this first in Berlin last Monday with a group of authors and commentators from the German policy space. The chief economist of the Ministry of Economics and Climate Action, for instance, was there. And on Tuesday, we did a launch in Paris where Jean-Noël Barrot, the Minister for Europe, came and commented. So definitely there is a lot of interest in this topic, but also we have already received a great many interesting comments. I am absolutely certain that this is not the final time we will be talking about how to think about European economic security and what are the ways to refine the instruments. In fact, we are planning a launch in Brussels soon, Jeremy. That's yours.
That's right. There will be a webcast presentation at Bruegel in June. The final date is still to be determined.
Well, I hope, listeners, you've enjoyed and gotten a lot out of this discussion of economic security and economic resilience. I know I've appreciated the chance to sit down with what's what and how to go about it. Thank you very much to Jurgen Zettelmeier and Beatriz Veda de Mauro for joining us. You can find this podcast and all of the references that we've thrown out at our website, bruegel.org, and this podcast on all your podcast channels. Hope to see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.